Good evening. I'm Sunny Hatch. I'm a scholar in the John P. McGovern Academy of Oslerian Medicine. And tonight in our Osler series, we are going to be discussing a book called Medical Apartheid that was written by Dr. Harriet Washington. Medical Apartheid, the Dark History of Medical Experimentation on Black Americans from Colonial Times to Present. This is an important book because it's considered a path breaking body of work in offering explanations for how a health system has perpetuated inequities and disparities among our nation's Blacks. And joining our discussion today is Dr. Susan McCammon, who's an emeritus scholar within the Academy. So welcome.
Thank you.
What can you tell us about Dr. Washington and about the book, just in general?
So, can you hear me? Okay. So, Dr. Washington, I believe, published this book in 2006, and her background is she's a journalist and she's been a bioethics scholar at Harvard. And this has been a passion project for her from, this project, I believe, took her over 10 years to bring to publication. And it is really looking at the history of the interaction of Black Americans with American medicine from the lens of race. To what extent are the treatment of Black Americans, has that been determined by race rather than other variables? And she cites all of the studies, very episodic studies that have looked at, the antebellum medical care of white Americans, Black Americans. Antebellum, there weren't Black Americans, they were enslaved people, and their health care was really determined by their employers, their owners. And that seems really distasteful to us, but when we think about where does our health care come from, right, it still comes from our employers. So that's a model that has persisted. And then she spreads that out across, the early 20th century, looking at medical research on vulnerable populations. And there are instances which are directed, where the target is Black Americans, but there are also projects where the target is not Black Americans specifically, but available subjects, and the proportion of Black Americans is far out of proportion to their representation in the population. So there's a disproportionate representation of Black Americans in the studies that she discusses in the mid part of the century, looking at vulnerable populations like children, like prisoners, like chronically ill patients. And then the last part of her book, she really looks at more modern conceptions of race, where we really struggle with, is race a biological category or is it a social category? And how do we move forward based on how we think about race?
I find it interesting that she argues that slavery and American medicine have been intertwined since the U.S. beginning. And she says, specifically regarding doctors' lack of empathy for Blacks. And she discusses in the book how the gulf in compassion has been an ongoing problem. And she focused on how the teaching practices, actually more so in the 19th century than what we have today, but may have resulted in the doctors losing capacity for empathy for Black patients because they were put on display and used for experimentation. And it was actually widespread, so that when new physicians left the medical school, from their training, they were deeply ingrained with the habit of looking upon Blacks as demonstration material, actually, and not as human beings.
So I don't think that it's a loss of empathy. I think it's an absence of empathy to begin with.
Good point.
And I think that one of the defining ideas for me in thinking about race in medicine, or race in general, is what's the greater moral failing? Is it to mistreat a fellow human, or is it to fail to see the humanity in another creature? So I think that a lot of what happened in the 18th and 19th century with Africans, African Americans, enslaved people was because they were not understood to be the same as humans. They were understood to be subhuman. And as soon as you made that transition, then all of the social contracts about you don't murder, you don't steal, you don't lie, you don't mistreat, didn't hold anymore because they were considered to be subhuman. And one of the things that Ms. Washington writes about so compellingly is the idea of scientific racism, which is a little hard to parse, but what it really means is using science to prove that the races are different. Not just different, but that there's a hierarchy, that one is better than the other. White is better than black. And that relied a lot on the idea of polygenism, or the idea that white people and black people were completely different races or different species, and that there was going to be biological evidence to prove it. And at first it was the color of the skin. And then when pathology took off in the 19th century, it was, opening the body and looking at the internal organs or the genitals, which were perceived to be somehow different from whites, to say, how are these two races different, and how can we prove that whites are superior to blacks? And then chapter 2 is, how can we use this scientific information to justify the enslavement of blacks by whites, which was really supported by the data from the 1840 census, where however you criticize the way the data were collected, showed that quality of life was poorer and mental illness was higher in blacks after emancipation. And so the conclusion that was drawn was that somehow slavery was benevolent, that black people and slaves were better off under slavery. And so this was a use of science, which is never objective. Pache, Dr. Fauci, and everything we went through with COVID, with science and its objectivity, science is always value-laden. So the efforts that were put forth to differentiate blacks and whites, and then to differentiate the moral hierarchy of what's better and worse, that's what science was devoted to in the 19th century, for better or worse, but that's what they were working towards.
You mentioned scientific racism in the 19th century, and she actually charts ways that scientific racism actually emboldened the surgeons in that time frame in the 19th century. And one belief actually was that blacks weren't able to feel pain, or any pain at all, that whites could perceive pain, but blacks could not. And some of the most tenacious beliefs was that blacks did not feel pain or anxiety, and it allowed surgeons to surgically explore them without the use of anesthesia.
So that is a persistent claim. It persists until today when we look at the prescription of opioid pain medicine to black Americans versus white Americans, and see that there's less, and infer that we're believing that there's still a belief that black Americans don't feel pain, or that there's a difference in perception. To me, it's very weird. I'm a surgeon. I'm like, people feel pain. I mean, and there's really literally not objective evidence that black people feel less pain than white people. But that does tie back to a ton of wishful perception and research in the 18th and 19th century, that somehow blacks were, they were resistant to malaria, they were resistant to heat stroke, they were resistant to mosquitoes, that they were in fact naturally destined to succeed in, the Delta, in the cotton fields, in the really brutal environments that existed. And it was, so one of the things that I think is fascinating and challenging about Dr. Washington's book is that there is a lot of contextual history that she's not able to include. I mean, it's an encyclopedic book. It's very detailed. The print is so small. the footnotes are so many. But for example, in the 1930s in Weimar Germany, for example, occupational health was getting started, and they were realizing that, okay, so like the rubber industry, the aniline dye industry caused cancer. It's terrible, it causes cancer. But they said, okay, but we see here are some people who are not getting cancer. And so what was their response? Was it to get rid of the toxins? No. It was to say, hey, let's take these people who appear to be immune to carcinogenesis and select them and their kids and their brothers and their genetic, pool and put them into this workplace. And I think a lot of that was at play in America in the 19th century, saying, wow, this is a really hot, wet, mosquito-y, disease-ridden area, and if we can define this population as somehow immune to these pathologies, then why, surely we're allowing them to achieve their best selves, right? So.
The theory of eugenics actually emerges during this period of time, during the support of racism in the early 1900s. And it contended that human breeding should be controlled to produce the most evolutionary fit offspring. However, eugenist appeals to science were a means of covering up deeply racist beliefs. And as a result, eugenists claimed that Black women are genetically prone to be bad mothers in support of their belief that Black reproduction should be limited. And as a result, we have people like Margaret Sanger or Planned Parenthood. Could you expound upon that a little bit?
Sure. So I think this is a really powerful chapter in her book. It represents a couple of different things. So for example, her book is about experimentation, but this chapter is really not about experimentation. This is about public health and epidemiology and medical treatment and outreach to women for Planned Parenthood or controlling reproduction. Eugenics really emerged, in the atmosphere of Francis Galton and understanding where, heredity came from and how we might, Mendel and his peas, and maybe we wanted white peas or green peas or good peas or bad peas, but we control it. And so there was, two branches of eugenics: positive eugenics, like we're going to do everything we can to get good babies, and then negative eugenics, which was we're going to do everything we can to not get bad babies. But then the criteria that go into what's a good baby and what's a bad baby.
Exactly.
Right? And there's, so much in this history. So, the Gerber baby, the beautiful baby trials, the idea that we could perfect humanity. I mean, we were really in a time, this was before antibiotics, but way before HIV and multi-drug resistant TB. I mean, this was in a time when medicine really thought they were about to cure everything, right? It was a very positive, and I don't want to say arrogant, it was just a very positive time. And there's so many things that go into the control of Black reproduction here. So Margaret Sanger, she's very famous for being a firebrand and an activist for birth control, for Planned Parenthood, for bringing the birth control pill forward, for bringing, family planning forward. And she has a very positive image for that. But she also, part of what she did was really propagate birth control pills to Black women. And the reasons, part of it is, are Black babies bad babies? Are they worse than white babies? Is there some genetic inferiority? So that's part of it. Or Black mothers worse mothers than white mothers? Or one of the arguments that was made was that the Black mothers who reproduce a lot are less good than the Black mothers who reproduce a little. There's so many factors that go into it. In 1967, there was the first protest describing the distribution of birth control to Black women as genocide. And yet there's a wide population of Black women who are very eager for family planning and the ability to control reproduction. And so that's an example of, a very wide trajectory of values. And that's one of the challenges I have with Ms. Washington's book is very often she takes her lens and her argument and looks at one argument and not the broader perspective. So that was a lot on that one, but I think it's a really powerful question.
Along the lines that we're discussing, though, how about the neurosurgeons doing the lobotomies on the Black children?
Ooh, lobotomy seemed like a really magic answer when it came along. I think not just for Black Americans, but for agitated female Americans. So I think that defining activism, protest, the desire not to be enslaved, the desire to be free as a pathology is something that's been going on for the last at least 200 years. And so we see it with, and I'm going to pronounce this wrong, but drapetomania is a pathologic term that means the pathology that leads slaves to try to escape, as if that's a medical condition, rather than a rational, normal desire to not be enslaved. What did you ask me?
About the neurosurgeons doing the lobotomy.
Oh, right. So pathology of misbehavior. So ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder, protest, escape, all of the ways in which people express their dissatisfaction with the status quo. And in the 1960s, it was discovered that if you, put an ice pick in, the orbit and kind of stirred it around, you could calm people. You could take away their agitation, their protest. And this was deployed on, American Black teenagers. It was deployed on American, sexually active females. It was, and this again, so Ms. Washington, she focuses her attention on how this played out in Black Americans, but it was not only Black Americans. I mean, women also suffered very much at the hands of the lobotomists. And it's not, I mean, that sounds like, oh, crazy talk. What, why, what? But I mean, it was, for some people, magic. It took people who were very agitated, very distressed, and made them very peaceful and calm. And then if you, jump ahead 40 years, we're looking at the 1990s in the studies at Columbia where they were taking younger brothers of Black men who had been imprisoned for violent activity to try to deduce from them what genetic or biological element was leading to, Black violence, Black agitation. So it's not gone away. The degree to which we create databases of gang members or people who've been arrested, their relatives, trying to parse a genetic basis for violence or savagery or heathenism. I mean, these are all words that in the 19th century, the white folks who went to the Congo, they were not like, we're just better because we're white. I mean, they went because they thought, oh, these people are suffering, they don't have religion, they don't have fresh running water, they don't have. I think there were some very well-intentioned people that just thought we can make their lives better by making them more like our lives. And they did not have any sense of the degree to which they were crushing the people that they were interacting with. So.
I guess the most logical next step is talking about Tuskegee, right? The racist beliefs of the public health service doctors is actually what we're talking about, particularly their view of Blacks as inherently promiscuous. And that impacted their attitudes toward dealing with Black men infected with syphilis And rather than attempt to treat and eradicate syphilis in Tuskegee, they elected to watch it and checked and let it develop. What can you tell us about Tuskegee?
So I live right next door to Tuskegee. I live in Alabama, and Tuskegee is about 140 miles down the road from me. And as a clinical ethicist and a historian, it's important to me, and I think also important to Ms. Washington, as a symbol that is sort of she calls it an overburdened symbol of experimental abuses of Black people in America, because it really stands for all the other things that went on. People are just like, oh, well, there's mistrust of the medical system because of Tuskegee, or oh, Tuskegee. But what Harriet Washington will argue is, in fact, Tuskegee was really minor compared to a lot of the other things that were going on. I mean, it turned out to be an observational trial, and I think the thing that was most shocking about it was that it continued for 40 years, from 1932 to 1972, with not a whole lot of remark. I mean, there were routine medical publications in like the New England Journal of Medicine, the Journal of the American Medical Association. I mean, you know, regular medical journals reporting on this. I think that the way you tell that story is really important, because it originated as a treatment plan. It originated with the Julius Rosenwald Fund. This is fascinating, because Julius Rosenwald, you like this, is our closest forerunner of Amazon Prime. He was a partner in the Sears Roebuck Company, and he is the one who brought forward the idea of mail order delivery and distribution by mail order. He was the first one who did that. And one of the first things he mail order delivered was houses, and then schoolhouses for Black American children who did not have any other alternative for education at that time. So the Julius Rosenwald Fund created actually a tremendous baseline of goodwill and trust among the African American community across the Southeast, and especially in Alabama and Macon County, Alabama, where the Tuskegee Institute was. And Booker T. Washington was the president there, and he and Julius Rosenwald became friends. And the thought was that they were going to do a treatment, like a screening and treatment plan for syphilis. And then the Depression, the stock crash, they lost money, they couldn't do it. And so the US Public Health Service said, okay, we can't treat it, but for the next 6 to 8 months, let's just observe it. And then after that 8 months, there was an idea that, you know, we have these 399 positive syphilis patients, and we want to see what the natural history is. And so they started this observational trial. And it was sort of medium bad until 1943, when penicillin was invented. Now, importantly, in 1943, penicillin wasn't made available to the public. It was only made available to the military, because they were the ones who had all the VD, and we needed their fighting forces. But in 47, it became available to the public, and it was clearly an effective treatment for syphilis. But at this time, the roster of all of the patients was delivered to all of the doctors in the county and in the state and in the military, so that these patients not only were not told their diagnosis, were not offered treatment, but actively had treatment withheld, so that they didn't get treated for their known syphilis, but they could not receive penicillin for anything else at the time. And over these years, there was really not much pushback. Even the active civil rights lawyers like Fred Gray, who brought the civil rights, or the class action lawsuit for them in 1972, even though he was active in civil rights at the time, had no awareness that this was going on. It's a pretty small county, and this was 399 patients and 200 controls, which is approximately 30% of the entire population of the county. So it was like a widely held secret. But what Harriet Washington will point out is that at this time when there was an observational non-treatment study, there were studies going on with African Americans in America and then non-Americans in Guatemala and Africa, where people were being infected with diseases, like deliberately given diseases to test treatment. So the badness of an observational non-treatment study has to be put into the context of the other things that were going on at the time. And for people to focus on Tuskegee as the worst possible thing that could have happened and the only thing that was happening is really misleading. Like, there was a lot of other stuff going on, and a lot of it was a lot worse.
Absolutely. Throughout the book, she talks about therapeutic versus non-therapeutic experimentation or research. And so therapeutic, I think of as to help treat or cure a patient with a disorder, and decisions by doctors are always primarily based on what may serve a research subject's health. But in contrast, non-therapeutic research pays little regard for the well-being of the patient. And research subjects are then viewed as a means for investigating medical issues for the future patient or for future medical knowledge. And she had a few of those examples in her book. And she starts off with Sims in the very beginning, and toward the end, she's even talking about the Atomic Energy Commission. It's amazing to me how much the American government was actually playing a role in a lot of these decisions for experimentation. Would you like to discuss any of those experiments?
Sure. So I think that the federal government's attitude towards the American public's obligation to participate as research subjects is worth talking about, because in the interwar years between the First World War, the Second World War, the Vietnam War, at the time when nuclear weapons were being developed, radiation was being understood as both a toxin and a therapeutic option. Bioterrorism was being understood. There were plenty of bioethical initiatives. I mean, the Nuremberg trials happened. We had the Nuremberg Code to talk about experimentation on human subjects, the Helsinki Declaration, the Geneva Convention, the Belmont Report. It goes on and on and on. And yet, the U.S. federal government didn't really not feel bound by any of that, because they felt like what they were doing to assess the danger of bioterrorism, nuclear toxins, radiation, other environmental toxins were all in the interest of the public. And it was very much, don't ask what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And so, whether they were spreading toxins over California to see how much showed up in your pee, or whether they were injecting you with plutonium to see how your bones deteriorated, there was really, and I'm not saying this is good or bad, because clearly I think it's bad, but there was really not a sense that this was wrong. There was really a sense that this was your patriotic duty, and for people who didn't have any other way to contribute, the disabled, the chronically ill, the impoverished, the developmentally disabled, there was a sense that this was a way for them to redeem themselves and find a purpose. And I think that does not ring true for us today, but that is really how they thought at the time, that dependent, institutionalized, incarcerated people had an opportunity to contribute, and it was our obligation to let them contribute. And so we made them subjects of medical experimentation.
Exactly. And, that brings us to informed consent. And, of course, it's some of that emerged that helped to actually protect prison populations and why they're considered vulnerable as well, especially Black children and Black prisoners. Informed consent is very much important in our day-to-day research, but can you broaden that as far as a topic, and what do you perceive to be a true informed consent?
Sure. So I think I've engaged with a lot of people who pushed back on Tuskegee and said, well, there was no informed consent. And I said, could there have been informed consent? Who would have given informed consent to be in an observational trial of untreated syphilis? Yeah, no one. That was not going anywhere. So I think the heart of informed consent is for people to understand what the need is and how much they want to be altruistic and meet that need, understanding to what extent the results may benefit them or their families, and to be a research subject in something that is never going to benefit them or their families, or not, if not their families, they're what Joel Feinberg will call the sacred universe of moral obligation, the people to whom you feel like you have an obligation. So one of the big concluding points that Ms. Washington makes is that, in the 20th century, we've exported some of our less ethical research into non-US sites, to overseas, to Guatemala, to Africa, to South America. And in addition to being less well-regulated, these are also places where information is being gathered in populations who will probably never benefit from the results of the experimentation. And so when we think about informed consent, there is the possibility that people are purely altruistic, and I think phase 1 clinical cancer trials are part of that, where you say, this is never gonna benefit you or your family or people you care about. It's gonna benefit future generations. And so this is a moment when you can volunteer in this way. And I would guess roughly 60% of people volunteering for phase 1 trials understand that. Many don't, and that's what we call the therapeutic misconception, where people think that they're signing up for something that might benefit them when we in fact know that there's really no chance that it's gonna benefit them at all. I think cultural context plays a big role. Like when I think about the Macon County, Alabama in 1932, the idea of a conversation to talk about studying untreated syphilis, that seems like a non-starter. But a conversation about treating syphilis and following outcomes, that seems like it might have gone somewhere. But this was in an era when there was no health care except what your sharecropping employer provided for you, which was really utilitarian to make sure that you could, be a productive worker. Yeah.
I've asked you a lot of questions. Do you have any that you would like to engage with the audience? Anybody in the audience have a question?
Yeah, I would love to hear some feedback on this.
You mentioned that you lived about 140 miles from Tuskegee, and that makes me wonder if you've noticed or any of your colleagues have kind of observed any sort of lasting effects of distrust among the Black community with seeking healthcare resources from those that live within that area.
So I find that there is a different level of expectation in my white patients from Mountain Brook and my Black patients from Macon County. As far as expectations of information, statistics, what's gonna happen, what I can expect, what I'm entitled to, versus how soon can I get out of your clinic, what is the least that we have to do, what, I wanna be treated, but I don't really feel comfortable or trust where I am. And so I work a lot with my residents on how we kind of overcome that, because I feel like it's one thing to walk into a clinic room with a plan to deliver equal information to everybody. But when my push factor is equal for all patients, but the pull factor from patients is very different in terms of how much they want to engage with the clinic and me and the plan. That can challenge that. So Ms. Washington really says that, you know, this trajectory of exploitation of Black Americans by the American medical and scientific system, and I won't call it all experimentation, because it's not all experimentation. Some of what she's talking about is medical treatment. Some of it is public health initiatives, quarantine initiatives, that kind of thing. So it's not all straight up experimentation. But I give her credit for pulling all of this together and saying, this is the way Black bodies have really been exploited in the American world.
If you haven't read the book, toward the end of the book, she's seeking ways in which Blacks can be, become part of the research community, to engage in research as subjects, and wants to bridge that gap. And how do we get there? So she's starting that dialogue, and that dialogue is very, very important. But you're right, we have to build a community of trust, don't we?
And then I suppose I have a follow-up question to that as well. After working in a clinic for a couple years as a critical care nurse, there's sometimes where certain situations I've been put in when patients have expressed distrust within their physician, a lot of times like that patient being a Black patient and the physician being a white physician. And it's oftentimes put me in a rather awkward or uncomfortable position because I want to advocate for the patient, but at the same time, also with me being a nurse, telling them, trying to explaining to them that this treatment option is a valid treatment option, and just kind of balancing that fine line with, you want to advocate for your patient, but at the same time, you understand the science behind the medicine. How do you, what advice can you give as medical students or clinicians or that sort of thing with helping to reassure your patients?
I think that's a really important question, and it's a topic that I'm thinking a lot about right now, because there's literature on, what's the importance of having racial or cultural concordance between doctors and patients or nurses and patients. Does it matter if a Black patient has a Black doctor, or a white patient has a white doctor, or a female patient has a female doctor? To what degree does that matter, and where does trust come from? I think that, I very much see in my patients the way their eyes light up when they see one of, a Black physician in the clinic, and they're like, oh, thank God, finally. And on the one hand, it's like, thank God there's a Black clinician. But on the other hand, I'm like, thank God it's just not all white dudes across the way. So there's like, you get away from the homogeneity of this. And I don't know that you have to have one-to-one representation of your identity. I think it's just the breaking down of the homogeneity, so that's not just a wall of one type of person. And then I think that truly listening to your patients and not making assumptions about them is the most powerful thing that any trainee in nursing or medicine can do. To just listen without assumptions.
Thank you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to follow up. You said just to listen, but also the questions you ask. I was paying attention last night. So the questions asked are also very important, because you can start to get the information maybe that you want through the questions that you put to that particular person. So
I think that's really true. And I'd like to share just a story about a patient encounter I had with a couple who was from Mexico and Spanish speaking only, and we had a certified interpreter. And I did my interview, we talked to them. And at the end, I'd read about this somewhere and I thought I'd try it out. I said to the interpreter, I said, is there anything you think I'm missing? Is there anything, you know, based on language or culture that I haven't addressed or that I need to talk about? And he looked right at me and he said, well, sex. I'm like, what? I'm a head and neck surgeon. I'm not going to talk about sex. That's below the neck. But it actually turned out, you know, it turned out to be incredibly powerful and valuable because somebody along the way, radiation oncology,
Probably.
told them they couldn't have sex anymore. And I was like, well, that's not true. But I think that that question of, am I missing something? Is there something that I should be asking that I'm not asking? I mean, it doesn't have to be a certified interpreter, but to a patient, to a family, to just sit and say, I hear what you've said, and this is where I think we're going, but is there anything more that we haven't talked about? Is there anything that I'm not asking about that I should be asking about? Is there anything that I'm missing about your family, about your culture, about your religion? You know, to just acknowledge that my assumption of what needs to be talked about is incomplete.
That's a good idea. How about others? Any other thoughts?
I'll go out on a limb here, but we've certainly seen issues with inequity and disparities in healthcare, and you know, an example that comes to mind is the differences in maternal death rates in this state and probably across the nation, and also a drive to remove history from venues in which people ought to be paying attention because it might make someone feel uncomfortable. So I think it's a very uncomfortable and frightening time, just in general. Right now, I think this is a very frightening time where things could definitely go backwards. That's not a question. It's something I think about quite a bit in terms of where this country is going and the forces that are driving us in many ways, I think, backwards.
I feel that very much also. When Dr. Hatch invited me, 2 years ago? Mm-hmm. You know, we put this off 2 years now to come and talk about Ms. Washington's book, Medical Apartheid. You know, that was before George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, before Black Lives Matter, before COVID. You know, the tension about talking about race has become much, much more heightened, and our trajectory, like our progress narrative, has become much more uncertain. Like, are we still progressing or are we regressing? Like you say, like maybe we're at risk of going way back. And so I came down here this week. I was very stressed out. I was very anxious about talking about this because I feel like it's really important to talk from your heart and to share and to be able to talk to other people. But there's, you know, we shortcut it as saying cancel culture, or this sense that there are things that can't be said or that are so far beyond the pale that, you know, they can't be put on the table. And that frightens me because I feel like if you can't put something on the table, then you can't address it. You can't think about it. You can't talk about it. Certainly, this book is fascinating. It's a fascinating book. And she has a very clear purpose. But it's not a perfect book. There are a lot of errors in it. It's very polemical. There are a number of fairly critical reviews of it about the factuality of it and the bias that she presents. And yet, after reading all of that, I still come back to it and I embrace it because I think that this is a moment when you put these lenses on and you say, we're going to look at this in this way, and we're going to see what it would mean if this were completely true. And it might not be completely true. Like, we can add in a whole lot of other historical context and say, maybe this is not as extreme as what she's describing. But this moment, when we look at it in this way, we can say, this is really wrong. This is really something that we have to pay attention to. Yeah.
Dr. Walsh?
Currently, we have a really good example of some need for diverse clinical trials. And so with pulse oximetry being kind of the latest identifier that it actually does not work very well in people of color and has a bias in that situation, how do we develop this community of trust so that we can enroll diverse populations so that an error like this doesn't occur in the future?
I think first we have to acknowledge that, you know, the vast majority of our inherited medical knowledge is built on a foundation of scientific racism. Whatever it is that we know was built on maybe a little bit of a shaky foundation. I think that one of the things I love about the book is it's just like, you know, wide open. I'm just exposing my breast to you. It's just like, let's just tear the Band-Aid off and look at this, because I think the degree to which we try to cover this up or mitigate it or say it wasn't really this bad is that really undermines trust. So if we just say, look, this was a shit show, you know, it was really bad, and we admit it, and we want to be different going forward. I think that there are new and different ways of advertising clinical trials to be more inclusive. One of the questions that one of the critics of Ms. Washington's book says is, you know, how much do Black Americans really know about this history? Are they really paranoid? Are they really in denial? They really have this iatrophobia, fear of medicine because of, you know, past historical offenses. And my sense is from talking to people that there is a very strong oral history and oral tradition of apprehension about engaging with the medical system. Like, I don't think this is hidden at all, but I'm open to hearing what other people think.
The GFR, that's
Yes.
that's my bug right now, because if you are African American, you get a whole different number,
Right.
which part of that number helps decide if you go on a transplant list, and or if you how close you might be needing or moving into renal problems, and yet they still haven't changed that. They haven't looked at. But if you ever run the true GFR like it is up above on your report, it's a whole different number. And so I'm like, well, come on, you know, because that's a real important marker that's used to decide whether or not a person is going into kidney failure.
Yeah.
So
It's very insightful. Thank you.
there you go.
Yeah, I'm just listening to everybody kind of talk about like how do we build trust in our system, whether that's enrolling in clinical studies or seeking medical care. And I'm curious what your thoughts are in your role, like in education and just generally in the medical education system, about creating maybe more of a supportive environment to get people into those roles to increase concordance. Because I feel like maybe that would be something that would increase people's trust in a system. I mean, it sounds like it from your experience as well.
I think we're at a really treacherous time. You know, I think that we're in a time when there are articles being published in mainstream medical journals saying there is no such thing as systemic racism. You know, that the focus on racism is counterproductive. You know, people criticize this book for being too overstated and frightening people. So I think that it is really important, really incumbent upon medical trainees to read and think and be willing to speak out to say, no, this is a real thing. This is not bullshit. This is not, you know, this is not some woo-woo, you know, critical theory thing that I live in a very conservative state in an incredibly conservative neighborhood and an incredibly conservative hospital. And so I'm around this all the time. And so I just try to encourage my trainees to be like, please just be like my teachers in public school in the 1970s who are just like, you know what? This is where the sane people are. This is, this is the middle road. This is the moderate road. This is what we have to do to be safe for all people, and try to hold the line against radicalization. That's all I can say, really.
I'd like to go back to Dr. Walsh's, and it may hit on some of you too. I think it's something that we don't consider when we start a clinical trial, that we don't pull in the different cultures for which we're to study and have them provide a voice to how the research is to be structured, and then how we recruit the patients, and how we make sure that we're delivering the message that we want to deliver to the individual enrolling. And to me, that's where we're amiss in our designs of our clinical trial. You know, it's a lot. In the very beginning of this book, she talks about, I think it's from Nigeria, isn't it? About the lion telling the giraffe story, you know?
Right.
And that's basically, when I look at research, research is designed primarily by people that are primarily white and educated and of moderate or wealthy incomes. And they're not studying that group usually. And there's also deception that she speaks of in the book about drugs that have been artificially targeted toward another race. Remember those conversations as well. So in order to get the drug approved, they deliberately targeted it toward another race because it provided them an opportunity to get the drug to market. So there's that deception that's out there too, is another layer in the community setting. That we are a body of information now with the internet and our accessibility to information. And of course, not everything we read on the web is valid, right? But it does fuel angst. And, but to me, that's my 2 cents, is that you engage the population that you're to study in your design phases and the trial rollout, and have them help guide you in how the research should be done and how it should be recruited.
And I think, to put something specific on that, using the methodology of community-based participatory research, where you really reach out to the people who are affected and bring them into community advisory groups, and not just pose your hypothesis to them like, this is what we think, how can you help us prove what we think, but to really say, what are the problems that you think are most important? I mean, not even to bring a problem to them, but to say, what do you think is the biggest problem, and what do you, engaging them in how to address it. And that is an entire methodology of sociological and medical research that is, I mean, it's pretty well developed. Not everybody uses it, but when you are doing research on a population that is not you, I think that's a really powerful methodology and place to start. Tammy, I can see you nodding. So.
I was thinking about each encounter, and I was thinking back to your like, first of all, it starts with self-awareness. So I think we all have to think about, where are we in terms of biases that we may not even be aware of as healthcare professionals, and how do we work on those? And people are really good at understanding encounter by encounter. So I was thinking about you going back to some, I don't remember if it was in the book, but the question about, well, do they really have an oral history of this? Do they really know? It doesn't matter, because they know when we've not been treated well. We know if it's tone. We know if it's nonverbal. I mean, there's research that says that communication, not the words, but the way that you say them and the way that you are dismissive of somebody even without saying it is picked up on. And so I wonder about even not discounting the small encounter by encounter that we have in terms of building trust. And you've said some great phrases about that, right? Like, what do you think is important, but then meaning it and being open in it, because that's where I think people also don't trust, right? When you say the words, but then you don't follow through on that. I don't know. It was just something that occurred to me.
Absolutely, yeah.
I definitely agree, and I also wanted to go back to that question in that, asking, is this something that's verbally talked about? How much do even this generation, let's say, understands that? I kind of think about a story that many of you may have heard. It's a little joke, if you will, about a mother and her daughter cooking a roast or some deal, and they cut the ends off and go along. Eventually somebody says, why do we do this? Well, I don't know, that's because we've always done it. Even if this younger generation doesn't completely understand all of the mechanics of what happened with Tuskegee, trust me, it is talked about in the African American community. And if they didn't pick up anything else, they picked up lack of trust. I may not know why not to trust you, but I know there's a history of lack of trust. And then when you fast forward to today, whatever gains may have been made, they've kind of been erased because things have really gotten very in your face, like it was years ago. And to her point, you also can just kind of tell certain things. And for so many years, we were discounted. So people don't really understand how much we do discuss in our race. I remember just being, even I know this person didn't mean it that way, but it was prominent at the time when everything was happening with George Floyd and whatnot. And the comment came out, well, if African Americans maybe if we could help them teach their kids how to respond when police officers pull them over. I had to really catch myself because this person that was even suggesting this, but it was out there in the media. I remember seeing it on the news, Channel 13
Maybe
News or
we
whatever,
could
in
teach
Houston.
the police how to respond.
And not only that, what was shocking to me, and I remember Jimmy Kimmel was talking to an African American actress, and he was like, okay, I'm just gonna be honest, I have a lot of African American friends. I didn't know about the talk that parents have, and that was what was frustrating. It's like, this is part of our culture.
Yeah.
When you're teaching, teaching somebody how to drive or learning how to drive, that was automatic on how to know what to do when you get pulled over. And it was sad because I didn't ever think about the fact that this wasn't ever taught in other cultures.
Yeah.
So a lot of talks about a lot of different things goes on within the African American community, but we often don't share that because sometimes when you say somebody's being a little racist, that gets discounted that you're being paranoid. And sometimes it is kind of a PTSD paranoia, but a lot of times it's not.
I think that's one of the points that she's making is that it's not paranoia. It's actually legitimate. It's justified iatrophobia. It's justified mistrust. So, and I think it breaks my heart because I think the fear, that I feel when I see the blue and red behind me, and it's real, and I'm sure it's 100 times worse for an African American person. And then I translate that into what it feels like to have a life-threatening cancer diagnosis in a clinic in which you feel like you don't really trust the person who's going to be cutting you open and taking care of you and your family. I mean, that is a position of vulnerability that so many of my white patients I don't think ever even think of. It's like, you're going to take care of me. I'm fine. I'm going to complain a bunch, but you're still going to take care of me. And then I have African American patients who I feel like don't want to be there. They don't trust me. They don't like, I mean, it's just everything about it is bad, and yet their life is on the line. And that breaks my heart.
Have any other remarks? Thank you for joining us this evening. Thank you for participating in our Osler series. And as always, remember to practice medicine with your head, your heart, and your hands. Good night, all. Thank you.